In this Kubernetes and CKAD tips number 24, we will briefly touch on config maps. We will see how we can create config maps. So a config map is an API object used to store non-confidential data in key value pairs. And pods can consume the config map as an environment variable or command line arguments or as configuration files in a volume. A config map basically allows you to decouple environment-specific configuration from your container images so that your applications are easily portable. And config map, by the way, does not provide secrecy or encryption. If the data you want to store are confidential, then use secret rather than config map, or use additional third-party tools to keep your data protected and private. So let's see how we can create the config map in a couple of different ways. So let me go ahead and then come out of this. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go ahead and create a config map. Then kubectl create, and you can use config map or CM. That's also fine. Now if you just see what all options you have in create config map, one of the things you will find over here in this is that you can pass the value from literal, which means that in the command itself you can pass the value, right? So that is this one. Now if you want to say key 1 value 1, something like that, you can do that. So what you basically need to do is that you need to say k create, and we'll use the short name CM config map, and then give a name, right, my config, and then you say dash dash from literal, and then here you pass the key and then value. Okay, something like that. If you do that, the config map will be created. Now to see the config map which got created, is a k get CM, my config is here. To view the config map, you can say k get CM my config o YAML. That will show you the YAML definition of that, and in that YAML definition you will find a section called data where it will have key and value. Just to notice here, if you run the same command, right, and you want to add one more key, you need to say from literal equals to key to value 2. Okay, and just need to change the name of the config because otherwise it will be conflicting, and then it will have the second config created. If you now want to view the second config, that is config my config 2, you will find both the values like key 1 and value 1 inside data showing up over here, right? So this is one way of thinking, like you have got a couple of configuration details you can attach to it, and then you want to display and then add them quickly. If you have, let's say, config map diff or the config values, or the values in the config map to be added are from a file, you can always do that. So let's create a file which basically hold a couple of config maps. So if I come over here, I run a small command, right, which basically does add a foo3 lily and then foo4 lele, okay, and then creates a file called config.txt. If you see that config.txt, and you will find that the values are in 2 different lines. Okay, so they are simple text file. Now if I have to create a config map, right, from this, so I'll say k create CM, that's a config map, and then name my config 3 mc3, and then I say that dash dash, and this time I'm not going to use from literal because I'm going to read it from the file. So if you have such that you don't have to keep adding from literal for all the values, you just say from file and then give the path of the file since we are in the same directory. So you can say config.txt. Okay, if everything is fine, it'll go ahead and create the MC3. Then you can say get cm MC3, and then you see that YAML will have the config text value, and these two are the values coming from the text file. So this is purely the multi-line thing. So this pipe indicates that this is multi-line. So as you see, they are broken into two different lines. So they are two different lines, right? Similarly, you can have environment files, right, which holds the environment variables. So if you happen to have that kind of file, let's see, I create a file which has a var1 val1, and then I have some commands, and then var2 val2, and then I put them in a .env file. That's the environment file. If I do that, and then I say cat I'm just gonna run this cat config.env, and I run this thing, you can see that this is a simple file with a couple of lines, and we also have a line break in between, which means that there are empty lines also, and then you can see that there is a hash command, all these things. So it basically to have identification like what is what, maybe we can add comments just like we add comments to our code file. And to generate a config file, config map from this environment file, what we can do over here, we can basically go ahead and run the same command which I did earlier, right? Now let me just wait for a second. So let me just clean this up. And then what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go ahead and create a config map. So I'll say create. If I do that, and I say config MC4, I just give a name as 4. And then here I will say not as from file, but I will say from env dash file. That indicates that I am basically reading from the environment file, and the environment file name is config.env. Okay, that's the name of the file which I created, right? And this is in the same path, so it should ideally create the config map called MC4. And if I say get and cm MC4, and I just want to view the output of that config map, you will find that the data shows var1 val1 var2 val2, all the comments and everything else got removed because they are not considered within the config map object, right? So this is quite convenient. If you have a lot of environment variables you need to deal with, put it in a file and then populate a config map out of that file to produce them. And later part of the demo, we'll see how we can use the same config map to populate the volume or environment variable, etc., while we create the pod. So with this, I want to thank for watching. Hope you have enjoyed.